Alright guys, this will be the third video for week 1. So this one we're looking at what we call the conflict resolution spectrum. I've talked about this a little bit in the last lecture. So hopefully you can pull this off the website, put it up on your screen and follow along as I talk us through this diagram. So this is one that was developed by my organization here in Ottawa called the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiation. You can see our logo in the top left. You can see that the title of this diagram is the Conflict Resolution Spectrum for the 21st Century. And here we have in blue on the left it says informal and voluntary, and then we've got that line with the red dots, and on the right side we have formal and mandatory. So the idea is that this is a spectrum. All of the different conflict resolution tools, well, not all of them, but a number of the most prominent ones, have been plotted on the spectrum from left to right, depending on how informal and voluntary they are versus how formal and mandatory they are. So let me begin on the right, because on the far right, because I talked about this on our last lecture. I said that the court system, adjudication in other words, or litigation it's sometimes called, going through court, it's formal in the sense that, you know, there's a procedure in place, there's rules, you know, you have to have a lawyer, there has to be a judge, sometimes there has to be a jury, and it's also mandatory in that if you are you know, charged for a crime, you must be in court, you must attend the court sessions. So that court system is the most formal and the most mandatory of all the ways our society has right now of really resolving conflicts, as you go to court. One step to the left from there, a little less formal, is arbitration. Now, I've been following the strike between the faculty and the administration at Nipissing University in the fall of 2015 quite closely, and I noticed that both sides never talked about arbitration. But arbitration is a system of resolving conflicts where if the two sides can't find another method of solving their conflict, what they do is they go to an arbitrator, and each side has a chance to present their case, and then the arbitrator listens to the evidence and the case of both sides. They kind of act like a judge, but they're not necessarily in the court system, and then they make a ruling, and they might rule in favor of one side or the other. Now, it's important to note that sometimes arbitration can be binding arbitration, so that the ruling that the arbitrator comes up with, it's binding in the sense that you must follow it. So again, it's very formal and mandatory. Sometimes a little less formal is if you have a complaint or a conflict, maybe with a business or about an employee in your workplace. You might go to your HR department and say, you know, I can't work with Bob or Sue or whoever anymore. They're sexual harassment or whatever. The HR department might launch a formal investigation to examine the situation, and they may end up firing, you know, if they find that the employee has broken a policy, a harassment policy. They may take punitive measures against them, or they may fire them or terminate their employment. So again, that's somewhat formal in that, you know, it's run through maybe through an HR department. There's someone who's a trained investigator, and there's you know, it's part of the procedures and policies of the organization. So it's formal in that regard. And if you are being investigated, I mean, there's a mandatory aspect to that. You can't say that, you know, I refuse to cooperate with the investigation. I mean, you could say that. They might say if you refuse to cooperate, you know, then we're going to terminate your employment. So again, investigation is another conflict resolution tool or technique. Moving along one step to the left, again, we've got mediation. Mediation is when the two parties can't get any further with their own conversation, so they bring in a outside mediator. The mediator brings some structure to the conversation, establishes a process, and like I mentioned in my last lecture, sometimes the mediator is usually the mediator is an outside, neutral, impartial third party. So they don't favor with either of the parties, they don't decide to support one of the parties. They're neutral. They are simply there to facilitate the conversation or the dialogue between the two parties. So indeed, if you go one step to the left again, we've got facilitation. Facilitation is really a technique where if there's two parties that need to speak but are having some kind of blockages to their communication, then a facilitator might open up the communication channels between them. Negotiation is another conflict resolution technique, and again, we're going to have an entire week of this course where we're going to explore negotiation quite in depth. And negotiation is simply the two parties talking amongst themselves. It could be very informal in the sense that they meet up in a coffee shop to have their negotiations, right? Coaching is another conflict resolution tool, and that says, you know, what I might do is if there's a party who is in a conflict and they don't know how to handle it, or they don't know the best way forward, is I'm mentoring them or coaching them or giving them advice and saying, you should do this, and have you thought about that? You might want to try this, and you might want to try that. So it's really supporting one of the parties through their efforts to resolve a conflict. It's a different kind of role. As you know, the mediator, like I mentioned, gets directly between the two parties and tries to work with both parties equally to get the conversation going, whereas coaching is working with one party to really bolster them through the whole process. And then of course there's dialogue, which is listed here on the far left end of the spectrum as the absolute most informal and voluntary. You can invite someone into a dialogue process. You might say, you know, if you got a problem with one of your coworkers, let's have a chat about this over lunch. And they say, no, I'd rather not. So it's very voluntary. You can't always force someone into dialogue. Indeed, it may not be a good idea to force someone into dialogue because they may not feel comfortable speaking, or what they share might not be of any value. So in many ways it's preferable to have someone voluntarily enter a dialogue because they want to talk about a conflict they're having or a problem they're having. And of course it's informal. There doesn't have to be written records. You don't you don't have to be in a special building to do it. You don't have to have a judge present or a lawyer. It can be all off the record. It can be done between family members. It can be done in a community dialogue. And it's very informal and voluntary. So what we have down below that spectrum then are a number of methods or mechanisms of using these tools. So we've got email, phone, Skype, live chat, online forums, Twitter, and then webinar. And the degree to which the bar goes to the right exemplifies, if email is appropriate to use that method. So you can see the email bar goes through investigations. So you could have an investigation into a workplace incident conducted through emails. You theoretically could do a mediation through emails. You could do facilitation through emails. You could negotiate through emails. You could coach someone who's in a conflict through emails, and you could have an email dialogue. Phone is the same. So certainly I've done phone mediation in the past. It's not the same as being in the room face to face with people, because you don't see their non-verbal body language, and you can't really read the person the same way, and so there's a chance for people to talk over top of one another on the phone because you don't always know whose turn it is to speak. But you can do dialogue, coaching, negotiation, facilitation, mediation, and investigation all through the phone. And similarly, you can also do that through Skype. Not surprising, because the Skype is basically like the phone, except we have the web camera added in. Live chat, you could certainly have a live chat for mediation, facilitation, negotiation, coaching, and dialogue. Twitter, you can have a Twitter dialogue. It's pretty difficult. I have my own Twitter account. You guys are free to follow me there if you want. I've got just over 600 people. And I've had some Twitter debate or Twitter dialogue with colleagues in the field about some stuff related to the field, like whether mediators should exert their power or not. And you only get, what is it, like 120 or 130 characters. It's hard to have a meaningful dialogue through Twitter. Nevertheless, if you want to put an idea out there and try to get people to reply to that idea, you can technically do that with Twitter. And for webinars, I would say webinars are another way of having a dialogue. Again, there can be some difficulties with this. In the past, I've taught online courses using Blackboard Collaborate, where you try to get everyone, if you got 10 or 12, 15 students in the class on the session, you try to get them to flip on their web cameras and participate in the webinar and have a dialogue about something we're talking about in class. And someone's mic cuts out, and someone else has got echo, and someone's got kids screaming in the background. Webinar is certainly not the best tool or method for conducting a dialogue. My preference is to have a face-to-face dialogue to pardon me, bring the two parties together into a safe, quiet, private room, no interruptions, no noise around. But you can also have dialogues in cafes, and you can sort out problems in the Tim Hortons if you if you want, and have the dialogue there. So that's the different online and distance dispute resolution tools: email, phone, Skype, live chat, online forums, Twitter, and webinar. And then the last thing we need to cover here is on the right side. It says features of online and dispute resolution in the blue and gray box. And it's important to note that we can have a difference between synchronous and asynchronous. Basically, that means synchronous is that we're all on the session together live, and so it allows for live and real-time back and forth, versus asynchronous. And so really, with my YouTube videos that I'm posting up to this course website for our class, this is asynchronous, and that it's kind of one-directional. And so that leads to our next point here. It talks about two-way versus one-way. So Twitter can be very much a one-sided. I'm going to pump out tweets and just keep pumping that out, and someone doesn't always reciprocate or reply back to my tweets, and so there can be a one-way direction built into Twitter. Private versus public, of course, pretty much everything you tweet is very public, whereas if we have a Skype chat and thus that's being recorded, that's certainly a more private mechanism for doing a negotiation or having a mediation or conducting a dialogue. Some of these tools are more suitable for working with individuals versus working with large groups. If I was going to use the telephone, for example, to have a mediation session, that would be fine with, say, 2 parties. But if you had 10 people on the conference call, I think that would be a nightmare. Whereas you could certainly have a pretty meaningful email exchange with 10 people, where everyone could hit reply all, and so email is probably a pretty decent tool for doing group mediations and that kind of thing. And then, of course, the other modality, or the other thing to consider here, is the text versus audio versus video. So, for example, email is strictly text-based, and we're just relying only on the printed word, whereas, the beauty of Skype, for example, is that we can see the person if they put on their video, but we can also hear them through their audio, but there's no written record. So that's one benefit of email. We can print out the emails and keep the record. So that's what I call the conflict resolution for the spectrum for the 21st century. The spectrum is the idea that we've got formal and mandatory processes of conflict resolution versus the other end of the spectrum, informal and voluntary, and we can plot in between there on that spectrum all of these different conflict resolution processes like dialogues, mediation, negotiation, arbitration, and so on. Moreover, it's updated for the 21st century in that we are recognizing with this tool here that some of these conflict resolution mechanisms can be conducted through email, phone, and that kind of thing. So a couple more key points I want to make here before I sign out. I want to remind you that online and distance dispute resolution, as above in that diagram, can occur through a number of different mediums. Some are purely verbal, and some are text-based, and some are a mix of both. Some are real-time, and some are synchronous, and some are private. And we already kind of covered a lot of that. And so I would say in most cases, in almost all cases, nonverbal body language and other visual cues to effective communication are lost with online distance dispute resolution. And that's a real problem. I don't know if you've ever had that, but I've certainly in the past had emails that I've sent with very, very good intentions. If you're not careful with your wording and your phrasing, because they've been stripped of all of the other nonverbal messaging, it's easy to misinterpret or misunderstand what someone's trying to communicate through email, and you might think they're mad, but they're not mad, or they might be coming across as very strict or stern, but they're not intending to do that. So we will spend a lot of time later on in this course looking at communication, especially looking at nonverbal communication and the importance that plays. So I won't say too much more about that at this stage. The thing with typing and email communications is that they're one-sided, and so that can slow the conversation down if you have to wait for someone to type out an email. But like I mentioned before, that also creates a paper trail, so there's a written record, but on the other hand, it's harder to retract something that's been said, so there's some formality to that. Depending on the exact situation, that can be either good or bad, that we can have a paper trail or a record of how the email exchanges. On the other hand, the parties can easily sometimes record calls and post them to the internet, and this can create privacy or confidentiality issues. And it's harder to build trust and rapport when the other party is disembodied voice on the other end of the phone. I would say that parties might be more willing to vent over the phone than they would if they were in a face-to-face setting, especially if the medium allows for some degree of anonymity, so you're anonymous. So if you've ever been on, checked out some of the comment sections, maybe on YouTube or something, because there's a certain degree of protection that you can post privately, and people don't know necessarily your real name, where you live, how old you are, and all that, because there's that sense of being anonymous. What happens is that people will say things on those discussion forums that I doubt they would say to that person in a face-to-face setting. If someone showed them a video on their phone, and then they wouldn't say the stuff they type into the comment section. So that's another thing to be aware of. The other interesting thing to think about all of these different technologies and how they apply to conflict resolution is that some of the older people may not be comfortable or adept at using online technologies. So if you're going to go out there at some point in your career and try to offer, say, online mediation services, through Skype, what you might find is that that will work fine for younger people and people from Generation X and the millennials, but the baby boomers won't know how to open up their browser, and they don't know how to log into Skype, and that becomes a problem. The last thing to mention here is technology glitches. They happen all the time. We've made impressive advances with our technology, and high-speed internet and LTE phone communications allows for fast downloads. You can Skype through your smartphone and all that kind of thing. But nevertheless, technology glitches will lead to echoes, drop calls, delays, static on the line, and all of that can be very frustrating and create an obstacle to good communication, therefore making conflict resolution much more difficult. Very difficult to have a meaningful dialogue if you're trying to talk about a serious issue and trying to work out a conflict if the person keeps getting dropped off the conference call, or their microphone cuts out and you can't hear what they're saying, and all of that just becomes a frustration and a blockage really to conflict resolution. So these tools can be helpful in some cases, but also have some inherent problems built into them as well. The last thing I'm going to do here then, just to wrap up this week, is to share with you a funny YouTube video, and it's basically a conference call in real life, and it kind of illustrates a lot of the difficulties that I just mentioned with doing online communications in terms of echoes and getting people dropped off the call and that kind of thing. Okay, guys, so that concludes my final week, week one. This is our third video. So after you watch this video, we should proceed on to the week 2 videos. So I will see you next time on our week 2 video. Take care. Goodbye.